Hi, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's very good to be here. I'm conscious of how the day is wearing on, and I will be, if not short and sweet, at least I will promise to be short. I'm also going to be saying things that are several miles wide and about 3 or 4 millimeters deep, ranging over a fairly wide area without getting into the nitty-gritty of any of them, but I can happily get into the nitty-gritty if you want. So if you want to ask about, well, what about what happened in the Vojvodina in 1942? You know, we can definitely talk about the Vojvodina in 1942. I am, of course, a historian, and historians represent. Historians like to think of themselves as sophisticated people. Unlike mere antiquarians who simply pile up the knowledge of the past, historians seek to explain change over time. They're interested in finding out why people in former eras acted the way they did when they might have acted differently, what structures and constraints steer them in particular directions, how it was that they should have been deeply concerned about certain things and indifferent to or oblivious of others. So for that reason, historians much more typically ask questions beginning with why rather than what. Knowing the facts of the past for them is by far the less important part of their enterprise. What truly engages them is piecing together what it all means. Well, that's a good approach when we actually know what happens, or what happened, but sometimes we don't. Medieval historians encounter this problem all the time. Sometimes all they may know of a particular ruler or a pivotal battle is a single mention in a manuscript whose author they know for a fact to be unreliable. Their difficulty in reconstructing the past is very different from the challenges faced by a historian of the modern age, whose problem might be that a dozen lifetimes isn't long enough to read all the potentially relevant documentary sources. How, for example, would a future scholar set about writing a history of Twitter, whose potential source base is being added to at the rate of 1 billion tweets a day? Well, when we turn to the history of sexual violence, we're paradoxically facing both problems at once. For earlier periods in history, or it may be for certain parts of the world at present, our situation is like the medievalists. Few written sources, and most of those requiring to be read against the grain. Paying as much attention, in other words, to the silences in the text as to what actually appears. In more recent times, we may find ourselves being swamped by our materials, which, to add to our frustrations, may be excessively profuse in some respects and infuriatingly uninformative in others. I think, though, it's probably true to say that at this particular point in time, as a general rule, most historians of sexual violence are closest to the medievalist than the scholar of social media. Our most pressing need is for data, and if some of us were inclined to be a little dismissive of our antiquarian colleagues, working in this particular field is a good cure for professional arrogance. While information does exist, it's rarely to be found in a convenient archive in a file neatly labeled rape or sexual assault. So sometimes our approach has to be a bit more creative, for example, by identifying places, times, or circumstances in which sexual violence is likely to occur, retrieving all the relevant records, and then trying to find out what they can tell us. For a while now, I have been engaged in something like this for the period that's occasionally described as the long Second World War. An era that began well before Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 and continued again well after the defeat of Japan in 1945. For me, that was a logical moment to start looking, firstly because the 1940s is the decade with which, as a historian, I'm already most familiar, And secondly, because we know, and I think it came out very clearly in a lot of our presentations today, that sexual violence is not just connected to, but embedded in other forms of interpersonal violence. That isn't to say that it's to be seen in all circumstances or all theatres in which armed conflict takes place. To the contrary, its prevalence, its deployment, the specific forms of that deployment is often highly asymmetrical. Don't worry, I can chant the around. But that asymmetry is something that in each specific instance requires explanation also. History resists typologies, at any rate, very robust ones. But one thing that wars tend to do is make hidden forms of violence visible as the need for, or even the possibility of, concealment begins to break down. So when we're speaking of conflict-related sexual violence, I think it's important, again, following the lead of others today, important not to define our parameters too narrowly. Traditionally, to quote the title of Lou Roberts' book, published in 2013 on one aspect of this question, we've been inclined to focus our attention on, quote-unquote, what soldiers do. But if we concentrate only on the brutal and licentious soldiery, we miss a lot of the story. We ought not, for example, to regard, quote-unquote, ordinary sexual offending by civilians in wartime as mere background noise to the more dramatic and seemingly meaningful crimes carried out by members of the armed services. For one thing, civilians too, in times of war, gain opportunities for predation that would never arise in peacetime. For example, having evacuees billeted upon them or refugees settled in their midst. Again, population shifts, one of the things that modern war does in spades, generated by industrial mobilization or military conscription, can have profound effects. By emptying a particular city or even a district of the cohort most likely to commit sexual offences, that is to say young men in their late teens and 20s, or, contrary-wise, by concentrating them in their tens or hundreds of thousands in other places, local patterns of sexual violence can be drastically altered, positively as well as negatively. We saw this, for example, in London in early 1944, where the rate of sexual offending was going off the scale to the point that a joint meeting of American military commanders, the Metropolitan Police, and health officials got together, and they finally decided that the only thing that would improve the situation was D-Day, for which they were devoutly praying. But when we take the more traditional element, if you like, acts by uniformed personnel into account, here, I know you've had your issues, Sally, with the poli-sci community, but yay for political scientists. They have developed a lot of useful categories of analysis in this area that historians can use as well. One of these is the distinction between rape as a weapon of war, in other words, purposeful action using sexual violence to achieve a policy goal, and practices of war, or actions that may not have been ordered by military commanders, but that for various reasons they chose not to prevent. Both of those, again, need to be distinguished from ordinary criminal acts perpetrated by men in uniform. Once again, though, it wouldn't do to assume that there's no difference between conventional sex offences in peacetime and similar or even identical acts carried out by soldiers, even if the perpetrator and victim are citizens of the same country. In a condition of total war, or wars approaching totality at any rate, the context in which these crimes occur is so different that they too are best considered under the rubric of conflict related to sexual violence. This is especially the case when you consider things like criminal prosecution, where in innumerable cases, what a sexual offence consists of is a movable feast according to whether it's committed by our brave boys in uniform or not. Or whether the courts think that instead of prosecuting somebody, he's going to go off, we'll ship Joe off to Guadalcanal in 3 weeks, and he'll either rehabilitate himself as a hero or the Japanese will shoot him, and win-win either way. In other respects, while we're generally aware of sexual violence in carceral settings like concentration camps, we pay far less attention to similar institutions that make for enhanced vulnerability. Workers' hostels, military bases and barracks, prisoner of war and internment facilities, and other establishments where rates of victimization may be greater. Locales of violence brought into being by war also remain after formal hostilities have stopped, sometimes for quite a long time. Some of these, like displaced persons camps, are fairly obvious. Others, like black markets, illegal, but you have to have recourse to them to get the stuff you need to survive. Or possibly goods trains used by the population to get around because the passenger network no longer exists. Less obvious, but very important parts of the story as well. Lastly, wartime sexual violence has its own temporal and spatial peculiarities. In the Second World War, it's generally known that some of the worst atrocities took place when the fighting was over, particularly in Eastern Germany, Hungary, and parts of Austria. If you've ever read the Martha Hiller's book, Eine Frau in Berlin, which they made a couple of bad films about, you'll know that one. What happened still later in Czechoslovakia and Poland as a consequence of forced population movements, much less well understood. Moreover, if we were to construct a timeline of violence or sexual violence, we might be struck by how much offending takes place just after troops capture a particular district, but also just after they're compelled to withdraw, just before they're compelled to withdraw from it. Though this particular generalization holds more true for Europe than the Pacific, large-scale sexual violence also seems more typical of areas where the occupying forces don't expect to allow the local population to remain for very long. More common there and less so in those parts of the world where they plan to be living with the peoples of the conquered areas for an extended period, even if the relationship between them is a brutally exploitative one. And finally, we must be aware, so to speak, of the dog that does not bark in the nighttime. Explaining, for example, why the Red Army committed appalling crimes in countries like Germany and Poland in 1945 is important, but so too is explaining why in similarly situated countries like Bulgaria and Yugoslavia it didn't. So this is a very brief overview. I'll have more to say in print and elsewhere in these matters in the next 12 to 18 months than is possible today in a 10-minute introduction. But I hope what I've said here will give you a hint, at any rate, of the direction which my work has recently been heading, and I'll be very grateful indeed to you for any suggestions that you may wish to make. Thank you.